we have Howard Frank Mosher. He is no stranger to the Upper Valley. He has spoken here at the bookstore many times, never in our new room though. And he even mentioned his event in his book, The Great Northern Express, and that was 5 or 6 years ago now, I think, which is one of his 2 travel memoirs. He read here and then he ran into a moose in White River Junction, and that made the book. God's Kingdom is Howard's 11th novel, and it's set in the Northeast Kingdom, which we've all come to know and love through his books, where he has lived for over 50 years. And he has been awarded many, many, many accolades for his writing, including Guggenheim and National Endowment Fellowships, the Vermont Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, the New England Book Award, the Academy of Arts and Letters Literature Award, and I could go on, but you don't want to listen to that, you want to listen to him. So without further ado, help me welcome Howard Frank Mosher.
I really appreciate Liza's kind introduction, because I've been a little gun-shy about introductions in general for the past several years, since one I received out in Denver, of all places. I had gone out there on my book tour, and I was going to have an event in the tattered cover bookstore that night, but somehow I had gotten roped into doing a radio interview early that morning. And I just had a feeling that wasn't a good idea. You know, those early morning disc jockeys, their whole purpose in life is to keep the commuters awake any way they can. And I knew he wouldn't have read my book, and I just sensed this was a mistake. But the publisher said, do it. So I did. And the guy began by saying that rather than introducing me by name, he would read some of the titles of my books, and he was sure everybody in the greater Denver listening area would know who the author was. Well, I was 100% sure that nobody in the greater Denver listening area would have the faintest notion who I was from the book titles. But nothing would do, but he had to launch into this enumeration of book titles, and they were really good books, but I hadn't written any of them. You know, novelists are, I don't know that I can speak for my colleagues, but this novelist is not a very fast thinker. The whole process of writing is very, very slow. And just to write a little book like this usually takes years and years and years. But for once in my life, I thought I had thought quickly. What I decided to do, as soon as he stopped reading those titles, which, by the way, were from Chris Bojalian's books, was say, I think that's Chris Bojalian's file that you have in front of you, and I happen to know he was coming there next week, and figured he'd be interviewed. And then I would say, but I'm Howard Mosher, and I'm here to talk about on Kingdom Mountain. And then I would launch right into a description of the book. Well, the best laid plans of mice and men, that's not what I said. What I said was, I think I'm Howard Mosher. And that was all this guy was waiting for. He pounced and he said, you think you're Howard Mosher. You think you're Howard, you mean you don't even know who you are? And of course, at that point, I scarcely did. I thought I would read 3 short sections from the first chapter of my new novel, God's Kingdom. God's Kingdom is, it's not really a sequel, but it's a kind of a continuation of the story of the Kinnison family, that branch of the extended Kinnison family from A Stranger in the Kingdom. This was the, it's an advanced reading copy, and this was the original cover of the book, but my publisher's sales force didn't like this cover, and so they said to the editors, send it back to the illustrator, and I do think they got a better cover. I like the new cover very much, but this is kind of a coming-of-age story about young Jimmy Kinnison from A Stranger in the Kingdom. It covers from his 14th year about through the time that he graduates from high school. And Jim knows that he wants to write, as I did when I was his age, and so there are some autobiographical elements in the book. And in God's Kingdom, he learns a great deal about some of the darker mysteries of the village, Kingdom Common, where he lives, but also of his own family. The first story is, at least on one level, a hunting story. It's called Blooded, and each chapter begins with a quotation from the Reverend Dr. Pliny Templeton's Ecclesiastical, Natural, Social, and Political History of Kingdom County. And so I'll read the excerpt first. On the earliest maps of Vermont, the wilderness that would later become Kingdom County was referred to as territory but little known. The first settlers called it God's Kingdom in reference to its remoteness and extraordinary beauty. To this day, you will occasionally hear the term God's Kingdom used to suggest the wild and unspoiled character of this last New England frontier. In those years in God's Kingdom, there was always a ridge runner. There was always one deer that was bigger, darker, and smarter, with 10 or more points on its antlers and a track 3 fingers wide and as deep as the snow was soft. Of course, there was more snow then. Back when editor James Kinnison was just Jimmy Kinnison, a boy who had not yet been blooded, it seemed that by Thanksgiving week at the latest, there was always a foot of fresh snow in Kingdom County. The year Jim turned 14, they referred to the ridge runner as Jimmy's deer. That old boy has your name on him, Bob, Jim's older brother Charlie told him. It was as though Charlie and Jim's grandfather and namesake, James Kinnison II, and Jim's father, editor Charles Kinnison, had let the runner grow to a great size so that it would be there for Jim to hunt when he turned 14. That was the usual age for a boy to be blooded in the kingdom of that era. They left for camp on Thanksgiving Day after the big meal at the Kinnison family farmhouse, heading up along the river toward the Canadian border in Charlie's pickup. Their gear was in the bed of the truck. The open-sighted .30-30 deer rifles they favored in the dense woods on the mountain, their sleeping bags, an extra set of clothing. Go light, the lighter the better, was Gramps' hunting motto. Gramp was already at the camp. Charlie and the editor and Jim would meet him there. As they bounced up the washboard road along the river toward the border, Charlie's empties rolled around on the towing chain under Jim's feet, clattering together like little glass duck pins. My God, Charles, you ought to hoe out your rig once every decade or so, the editor said. Why? Charlie said. I'm just going to give it to Jim when he turns 16. He can hoe it out then. The road ended in a brushy clearing beyond which the river widened into pond number 1. The camp boat, a former lumbering bateau painted dark green, sat upside down under a tarp in a stand of black spruce on the shore. They transferred their gear from the truck bed to the boat and started out across the open water. Charlie rowed, the editor sat in the squared-off stern. Jim sat facing backward in the bow. The surface of pond number 1 was calm and the same steel gray as their rifle barrels. Jim was excited by the prospect of hunting the ridge runner. He glimpsed it this past July when he and Gramp were fishing pond number 1 from Gramp's Old Town. They'd spotted the buck drinking from the pond near the collapsing logging dam across the outlet. Except for a white patch on its chest, it was as red in its summer coat as a Jersey cow, and its horns were in velvet. Jim counted 6 points on each side. The deer lifted its head and watched them for a moment as water slid off its dark muzzle into the pond. Then it made 2 long bounds and vanished into the woods. Gramp looked at Jim and nodded. That was all. But Jim knew that this was the ridge runner. Come hunting season, if he was smart enough to walk it down and shoot it, this was his deer. Now I'll skip to after supper at the camp. I noticed you reading the camp log before supper, Jimmy, Gramp said. Yes, sir, Jim said. They didn't shoot many deer up here in the early years, did they? There weren't many deer to shoot, Gramp said. There were very few natural meadows for deer to graze in, just unbroken woods when the first Kennison came here. That would have been your great-great-great-grandfather, Charles I. He came here to hunt men, not deer. Gramp never hurried a story. After a pause, he said, Charles Kennison I was born in Scotland. He fought at Culloden with the Bonnie Prince in the uprising of 1745. After the battle, he fled to America and settled in Massachusetts. He first came to Vermont in 1759 with Robert Rogers Rangers. They were on their way north to Canada on what they called a retaliatory raid against the St. Francis Indians. Gramp looked at Jim to be sure he was listening. The only sound in the camp was the low ticking of the fire in the Glenwood. 4 miles west of here, where the river empties into the big lake, Rogers' advanced scouts came across a small band of Memphremagog Abnakis drying salmon on wooden racks. The Rangers bided their time. Come nightfall, they formed a human chain, crossed the rapids, and crept up on the Indian encampment. According to Charles I, the Memphremagogs were holding high frolic around their campfires, dancing and celebrating. The Rangers caught them unawares and slaughtered every last man, woman, and child. Jim's father closed the camp journal. That was a long time ago, Dad, he said. It happened, and it was a terrible thing, but times have changed, thankfully. The editor gave Gramp a look. Jim couldn't read, but Gramp continued his story. Charles I reported, Jimmy, that some of the Rangers cut off the heads of the murdered Indians and played at 10 pins with them. Finally, Major Rogers made them stop. Jesus, Dad, the editor said, we don't know that for a fact. Jimmy doesn't need to hear that. Charlie winked at Jim. I wonder what they used for pins, he said. Who's telling this story, gentlemen, you or me? Gramp said. The story's over, the editor said. It's pretty much the story of the settling of America, and thank Jesus, it's over. Not quite, Gramp said. Some years later, Charles I returned here. He married a Memphremagog woman named Molly Molasses and became the first white settler in God's kingdom. He said he settled here to do penance for killing the Indians. If so, he could scarcely have picked a better purgatory, Jim's dad said. This was the end of the known world in those days. Territory but little known, they called it. Actually, Gramp said, Charles I built a trading post and a whiskey distillery at the mouth of the river and became quite wealthy. That's a good way to do penance, Charlie said. I wouldn't mind doing penance by getting rich. They all laughed, and Jim felt relieved because he did not like tension in the family, even when some of it was just joking. What do you say, boys? Gramp said, standing up. If we're going to tumble out tomorrow morning and get this boy blooded, we better tumble in now. Hop down, Jimmy. Time to bank the ashes. Jim jumped down off the wood box, and Gramp got a chunk of yellow birch and put it in the Glenwood's firebox and raked coals and ashes over it. The burning birch bark gave off a wintergreen fragrance. Jim could still smell the sweet scent a few minutes later from the camp loft, where he lay in his sleeping bag in the darkness, waiting to fall asleep, waiting for morning to arrive. So I'll skip again and read one more paragraph. Jim goes out early the next morning and he picks up the track of the ridge runner, and as his grandfather has taught him, he undertakes to walk the deer down. And there's still guys, probably within 10 miles of us tonight who know how to walk down a deer. I didn't know this when I first came to the Northeast Kingdom, but old timers told me that a man actually has more stamina than a deer, and if he gets on the deer trail and follows it long enough, it might take a day, it might take a day and a half, sooner or later he can walk down that deer and shoot it. So Jim follows the deer down the river and over into Canada and up the mountain and back down toward the logging camp, and then toward evening, as the deer is tiring, he follows it back up onto Kingdom Mountain, which is right on the Canadian border above the above the deer camp. And that's where I'll pick the story up. On the edge of the tree line, just below the height of land, the deer had collapsed again in a miniature forest of ancient, wind-twisted spruce and fir trees, no higher than Jim's knees. As he approached, it sprang up and went crashing through the snow, its tail flashing like a white flag waved in surrender. But the runner was not yet ready to give up. The mountaintop above the timberline was strewn with mossy boulders. The largest of these was the almost perfectly round, balanced boulder, a huge glacial erratic. To Jim, It looked like a gigantic, dark bowling ball. The runner was standing at the base of the great round boulder, its legs trembling from fear or exhaustion or both. In the westering sun, hazy through a film of crystalline snowflakes, the animal was as red as it had been in its summer coat when Jim and Gramp had come upon it drinking from the pond back in July. One of its antler points had been snapped off, probably in combat with another buck. The runner squatted and peed nervously, its legs shaking as Jim slowly approached it. Jim raised his rifle. His hands on the stock and trigger guard were as steady as the granite outcropping on the mountain. His heartbeat seemed to slow as he thumbed off the safety, and that's where I'm going to stop. You can find out what happens if you buy a copy of God's Kingdom. And if you can guess what happens, you are much, much smarter than I am, because when I got to that point in the story where Jim thumbs off the safety, I did not know what was going to happen, and it surprised me. And what surprised me more was the reasons I made up for its happening. And I think I've told you enough about that. I thought I would just visit with you for 10 minutes about where some of my fiction has come from, and maybe where fiction comes from in general. I don't really know where it comes from. It comes from some combination of the writer's experience and observations and reading background, all sort of filtered down through the writer's imagination. But I want to tell you 3 stories. Some of you have heard these before, but my wife accuses me of telling them differently every time. So there will be some variations. But I have 3 stories, and they illustrate where some of my fiction has come from. I grew up in a great big storytelling family over in the snow belt of upstate New York, up between Syracuse and Rochester. And none of the Moshers had any money, or I might add, as nearly as I can remember, a job. But they were all masterful storytellers. And I can't remember a time when I didn't want to write stories. But of course, at 5, 6 years old, I had no idea in the world how to go at it. But I did write little stories about this and that. And I want to tell you about the first and possibly the only good piece of advice I ever got about writing fiction, and it came from an unlikely source. It came from my 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Erla Battle Axe Armstrong, who had been hired to keep order in the little 3-room country school that I attended. And she was I don't remember much about her teaching, but she was very, very good at keeping order. She had biceps like David Ortiz, let me tell you. And, I felt their full force more than once. So one day in class, she caught me writing a little story when I was supposed to be doing my homework, and she confiscated it and looked at it and gave a contemptuous sniff, and she called us little 12-year-olds by our last names. She said, "Mosher, if you want to write, you've got to do 3 things. You've got to read the classics, you've got to revise your work, and you've got to write about what you know." And you, my boy, have a very long way to go in each of these departments. So, but she was right. That was great advice. You know, no one's ever given me any better advice. Read the classics, revise your work, write about what you know. You're all set, right? So, years and years later, when I got ready to write my novel Northern Borders, about the little boy who in the late 1940s goes to visit his grandparents in the Northeast Kingdom, I needed a mean school teacher. And it took me exactly 1/3 of a second to remember Earl of Battle Axe Armstrong. So I did a very bad thing. She's the only real person that I ever wrote about whose name I did not change in my fiction. And the reason I didn't is I could not think of her as anybody other than Earl of Battle Axe Armstrong. So, you know, by then she was, you know, holding sway over some celestial classroom where she's been for a long time, but I owe her a great deal because of her good advice, and I owe her an apology, but I just couldn't see her any other way. Second story. When my fiancée, Phyllis, and I were seniors at Syracuse University, she was studying for a degree in science education and certified to teach science. I had just a general English degree. And we thought that, I thought that maybe the way to learn how to write stories that somebody other than Phyllis might want to read was to go to graduate school. And boy, was I wrong about that. But that's a somewhat different story. We'll get to that. We didn't have any money, so we decided maybe we could both teach for a year or two and save some money, and then maybe we could both go to graduate school. We heard about a couple of jobs, science job, English job, in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and we didn't really know where or what the Northeast Kingdom was, but we borrowed my grandparents' old Super 88 Oldsmobile, and on April 30th, 1964, we drove from Syracuse, New York, up to the Northeast Kingdom, and as we came in to Orleans, which is where we had the teaching interviews, there were two guys having a fist fight right in the middle of Main Street. That was our introduction to the kingdom. So I cannot believe I was ever this naive, but I was. I rolled the window down and I said, "Excuse me, but could one of you gentlemen please tell us how to get to the local high school?" And the taller of the two guys, who seemed to be maybe marginally winning the fist fight, of course they're both wild, crazy, drunk out of their skulls and couldn't hurt each other much, but the bigger the guy said, "We can do better than that, we can take you there," and uninvited, they piled into the back of Graham and Graham's car, and I'm not kidding, it smelled like the Anheuser-Busch Brewery for the next 2 weeks after those guys have been in there, and they got us lost all over town, down driveways, and over in the Ethan Allen Furniture Mill, lumber yard, and finally, by sheer chance, they got us to the high school. So they got out of the car, we thanked them. They started off down the street arm in arm, laughing, happy, and I turned into the parking lot at the school, and as I did, Phyllis said, "Look back there." And the two guys had resumed their fist fight in the middle of School Street. They started up again. Phyllis said to me, "Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom, sweetie." That was an introduction. Well, we somehow miraculously landed the teaching jobs, And within a very short time after moving to the kingdom, 2 or 3 weeks, I began to realize that I had stumbled onto a gold mine of stories that no writer had ever told before. No writer had ever touched all this wonderful material in the Northeast Kingdom. Robert Frost spent one summer on Lake Willoughby. He had hay fever, and he came up to Lake Willoughby to see if that would help with hay fever, and wrote one poem, so far as I know, set in the Northeast Kingdom, set on Lake Willoughby. Very dark poem, one of his great poems called Servants, about madness and isolation. And other than that, I don't think anybody wrote a word about the kingdom until I got there. Well, I wasn't ready at 21 years old to write about the Northeast Kingdom or any place else, but I was ready to hear those stories. And I'll tell you just one. Not long after Phyllis and I arrived in Orleans, our landlady invited us over for coffee and cake. She's probably at the time my age, in her early 70s. And she told us a story. She said that during the Depression, she and her husband had owned a little dairy farm near the Canadian border, up in the woods near the border. And like so many farms during that era, it was going under, and they were about to lose it. So she decided that she would put to use the only skill her father had ever taught her. And I had the feeling, although she didn't exactly say this, that her father had been a bad guy, a really abusive guy, but he had taught her how to make really good moonshine whiskey. So she set up a little still on the brook that ran through the farm, and one night as she was running off the moonshine by lantern light, she looked across the brook and she saw what she described as a pair of city shoes with a man wearing a city suit standing in them. What a picture. And she said to him, I know who you are and I know what you want. You've come here to arrest me. She knew he was a revenuer. He was. She said, but I want you to know that if you do, we're going to lose our place. So she looked back at the still, and when she glanced across the brook again, the guy was gone. Well, they held on to the farm somehow. And they had 7 kids, put them all through Orleans High School and the University of Vermont. Phyllis speculated privately to me that Verna, our landlady, probably kept right on making that good moonshine to send him to college. And she didn't say so, but she might have. I hope she did. And then her husband became sick suddenly and died very unexpectedly. And she ran the farm on her own for a few years, but it got to be too much, and so she sold it and bought a little place in the village. And one night, a few years before Phyllis and I moved to Orleans, there was a knock at her door. And she recognized the guy standing there in the city shoes and the city suit. She hadn't seen the revenuer for 25 years, but she recognized him. And she said to him, have you come to arrest me again? And he said to her, no, ma'am, this time I've come to marry you. And he did. And they're very happy together, just as she had been with her first husband. He did a nice thing. She had always wanted to see the ocean and see a Red Sox game in Fenway Park. And of course, he took her to the ocean and to see the Red Sox game. But then a year or so after they got married, he died quite suddenly. So when she finished the story. She looked at us, and I can see her right in my mind's eye right now. She had lived a tough life, but she had very kind eyes, and I can see those eyes right now. And she said, "Now, Howard and Phyllis, I don't want you to think that I'm complaining. I have nothing to complain about. I've had a wonderful life. But I reckon I just ain't had good luck holding on to my husbands." And at that point, I looked at Phyllis, and she looked at me, and we knew, one way or another, that I was going to write the stories of the Northeast Kingdom. Okay, last story. I was young. See, I'm trying to make excuses for myself. I was young. I was impatient. And, you know, I was beginning to write those stories, but it's a long apprenticeship. You know, you got to read a lot of classics and do a lot of revising. And as far as writing about what you know, I didn't know anything at 21 years old. So I didn't know the Northeast Kingdom well enough to write those stories. So I was, you know, kind of just spinning my wheels. And I thought, I got to go to graduate school. I got to find out how this is done. Well, that was about the time when these Master of Fine Arts writing programs were really beginning to take off all over the country. And one of the really good ones was out at the University of California at Irvine. So I applied, and wonder of wonders, got accepted. And much as we hated to leave the kingdom, we went. And within less than a week, I realized this was the worst mistake I had ever made in my whole life. And I didn't quite know why. I just knew it was. But I know why now. What I had done is I had cut myself right off from all that wonderful material back in the kingdom before I understood it well enough to write about it. It was a mistake. And Phyllis said, well, let's go for a ride and see if we can get some perspective on this situation. So we did. And we wound up at what has to be the least inspiring place on the face of the earth, which, for my money, is downtown Los Angeles at the intersection of Hollywood and Vine. And that's where we were, and the traffic light was red. And I honestly believe that had it been green, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but it was red. A city telephone truck pulled up behind us. All I can think is that the driver saw our green Vermont license plate, because he called out his window, "I'm from Vermont too. Go back while you still can." It was like the muses on Mount Olympus sending us a message. We went right back to our apartment, we packed the car, and 4 days later we're back in the Northeast Kingdom. Well, Phyllis found a science teaching job right away, but there were no English teaching jobs available. But I heard about a guy named Jake Blodgett, who still logged with horses. He was a real old-timer. And he lived up near the Canadian border, up north of Orleans, a few miles. And somebody said, you know, Jake is looking for a helper. And I thought, well, you want to learn about the kingdom, you're not certainly going to learn anything about horse logging, teaching English. And I went to see him. He lived in a shack with his housekeeper, and just attached to the back was a shed where the horse lived, and there was kind of a half door with a window in it, so the horse could put his head through. And when Jake would sit in his overstuffed armchair and read in the evenings by lantern light, the horse would put his head through and rest on Jake's shoulder. Well, the logging horse was 22 years old. It was a good horse. And so Jake came to the door, and he was a big guy, snowy hair and just piercing eyes. And I said with some trepidation, "Mr. Blodgett, I'm Howard Mosher, and I hear you're looking for a helper." And he said, "Maybe," as though it were two words, "maybe. What have you done for work before?" And boy, I had the feeling right then and there that this guy did not like school teachers. But I had to tell him, well, I've been a teacher. He said, "That ain't going to help you up in the woods with me." But bless his soul, he took me on. And I worked with him all that fall, and my job, as Jake put it, was to run the horse. We were cutting pulpwood. Back in those days, you know, you cut the, this was before the advent of the chipper, and so you cut it up into 4-foot pulp sticks, as we call them. And so Jake would, with his chainsaw, fell medium-sized spruce and fir, limb them out, and then I would hook one or two on behind the whiffle tree behind the horse and take them down out of the woods and cut them up into those 4-foot sticks and stack them up. And all that fall, every time I turned my back on that horse for so much as 10 seconds, he would start to edge off toward Jake's house a mile away. And Jake would say, "School teacher, your horse has run off on you again." And he would laugh. I never knew what the word sardonic meant until that, but Jake would laugh sardonically. "School teacher, your horse has run off on you again." So as long as I walked toward the horse would continue walking away from me, but if I trotted, the horse would break into an amble, and if I ran, the horse would gallop all the way right down to that shack. And if I chased him down to Jake's house once that fall, I did it a dozen times, always to Jake's delight. So that brings me to, back to where does my fiction come from? Over our lunches up in the woods, and after we got to be friends and began hunting and fishing together, Jake Blodgett, the old Prohibition-era whiskey runner, told me many of the stories that wound up in my first novel, Disappearances. He became the inspiration for Noel Lord, the old logger, in my short novel, Where the Rivers Flow North. And in 1972, when our son was born, we named him Jake, after Jake Blodgett. And with that, if you have any questions at all about the writing life or Jay Craven's wonderful movies that he's made of my books, or anything at all, I would be glad to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
My first introduction to New England was reading Peyton Place as an 18-year-old. In the British Army, Salisbury playing in England. And it occurred to me then this would be a hell of a good country to visit at some time. There seems to be an awful lot going on. Did you have anything along those lines in Kingdom County? Did you have any of this kind of, these characters and behavior and
the Peyton Place type?
the Peyton Place of Vermont? I mean, I'm not sure.
And we had something worse.
Okay.
Yeah, we had just up the street from where Phyllis and I live in Irisburg back in 1968, a black minister moved to town from California with his family. He was trying to get away from Watts, which was just, downtown LA going up in flames that year. And within a week or two of his arrival, some drunks drove by his house and they fired a shotgun blast through his front window. And some of the pellets from the shotgun landed in the back of the chair that the minister's wife was sitting in watching television. So, and this happened just 300 yards up the road from our house. Well, the drunks not satisfied with that, drove past the house, stopped, backed up, and fired another shotgun blast through the window. Now, luckily, they didn't hit anybody, but within a matter of 2 or 3 days, everybody in the Northeast Kingdom knew who those night riders were because they were going from bar to bar to bar bragging about it. But there were no arrests until the state police, the local newspaper editor, not, I need to say quickly, from our wonderful weekly, The Chronicle, but another paper, and the local state's attorney trumped up adultery charges, not against the shooters, but against the black minister. And the upshot of this was that eventually, he had some support, of course, in the community, but he didn't have enough support, and eventually he packed up his family and went back to California. Well, you couldn't be a writer and live just down the street from where this had happened and not write that book. But I worked, not steadily, but off and on for 20 years on that book. And finally one night, as I had the minister's character, but I kept sensing there's something missing from this story that it's there, but I'm not seeing it. So one night, as I was working on the book, Stranger in the Kingdom, I wrote a sentence that went something like this. When I was a boy growing up in Kingdom County, my father and my older brother Charlie couldn't say 2 words to each other without getting into an argument. And right then and there, I knew I had the angle of approach to A Stranger in the Kingdom. That voice was Jimmy Kennison's, also from God's Kingdom, who goes on to tell, at 14 years old, tell the story of A Stranger in the Kingdom. And within just minutes, I had come up with Jimmy's father, the editor, his older brother Charlie, the hotshot attorney who defends the minister and A Stranger in the Kingdom. To make the story a little bigger, in Stranger I added a murder to it. The minister is accused of the murder. But I remember an article that Life magazine did about what they called the Irisburg incident, and referred to it as one of the most horrible racist incidents in 20th century New England. And what it did was to bring out a lot of latent racism in the Northeast Kingdom. And, you know, I would have thought maybe the Irisburg incident was something that might have happened in Mississippi in 1920. But Vermont in the 1960s, go figure. Any other questions?
Do you think the minister ever read the book?
He did.
He did?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, he understood it was fiction, and he had several children, and they read it and been in touch with me. My neighbors weren't too happy with me for, as they said, digging up that story, and Phyllis said to me, that's one reason you have to write this book. You have to tell this story. And that's the first thing I want to tell you. And the second, she said to me, the second thing I want to tell you is they'll get over it. And they did. I was coaching the high school baseball team, and we won the championship the next year. That was more important to me than anything. And you know who was really angry about the book? All the people who didn't read it. And I would say, please read the book, and then we'll have a conversation. They didn't need to read the book. Yes.
Yeah, that incident was on PBS this week.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but my question was, I think it was a disappearance. There was the white owl.
Yes.
Can you give us a background on that legend, or myth of the white owl?
Well, yes.
Or did you think that up?
I did make it up. There is a white owl in my wild and crazy first novel, disappearances, which people either love or probably hate, but there's no middle ground on it. And the white owl has some foolish symbolic connection to the villain Carcachoo. I wouldn't do that now in a million years, but in a way I'm glad I did that. And I made all that up. Yeah, every word. But thank you for your question. When Disappearances came out, a very prominent North American newspaper began its review of disappearances with the headline, "Vermont writer should disappear." That was the best part of the review, and it ran very sharply downhill from that point forward. You know, if that happened now, I wouldn't like it, but I could deal with it. But imagine that happening to a first novelist. Yes. Yes.
Will you tell us what you're working on now? Is it another novel?
Yes, I'm working on a novel that tells the complete story of the character of Pliny Templeton, who wrote the Ecclesiastical and Natural History. Pliny Templeton appears, who is himself a black minister, appears in A Stranger in the Kingdom, and also more prominently in God's Kingdom. And Pliny is based on Alexander Twilight, who graduated from Middlebury College in 1823, and whom Middlebury claims as the first African-American college graduate. Alexander Twilight did come north to the kingdom. He was a minister, became minister of the Congregational Church in Brownington, and then he built a magnificent 4-story granite academy, still there. Many of you have seen it, right up in the wilderness, and he and his wife together taught all the classes for many years, from first grade right through solid geometry for the high school seniors. So I won't tell you any more about Pliny and God's Kingdom, but I'm working on his entire history. Now, I give him a somewhat different background in the fictional character Pliny Templeton. He runs away from slavery and comes north, and there are some other changes. Yes?
Do you just focus on one book at a time, or do you start and maybe go somewhere else with another? I mean, do you just keep one going, or do you have more than one?
Well, I keep one going, but then I often have kind of another one in the hopper that I might work on in the late afternoon or the evening, and so I like, when I finish one, to have another one pretty well underway. But they take a long time, even the short, a short book like this. God's Kingdom is, I think, 240 book pages. It was 1,100 single-spaced typewritten pages just as recently as 2 years ago. So, that's I guess I learned that from Mrs. Armstrong. Revise your work. Someone had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you finish a book and you're ready to give it to the publisher or submit it, are you at the point where you can read through that work and not find yourself changing a word?
No.
I mean, is there any point when you get,
No.
you ever get to that?
No, there isn't. And it's a. I've often thought it's a little bit like baseball. Even when you're really swinging the bat well, you're only going to get about one hit out of every 3 at bats, and it's those other 2 times that are painful. So you get it as close to your original vision as you can, and then frankly, you just run into your own limitations. I remember when I started writing a little more seriously in high school. I was reading Ernest Hemingway, and I read Hemingway's first story collection, In Our Time, set up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Beautiful, elegant stories. I think that was his very best book. So, Hemingway, short sentences, 5 or 6 words, 3 or 4 words. So all my sentences were short, like Hemingway's. Then I got to college, and I began to read Faulkner. And, you know Faulkner, you know, a short sentence is maybe 300 words, and my sentences lengthened out accordingly. And then when we moved to Orleans and I began to wrestle with the material of the Northeast Kingdom, I went through a very bad patch where I would write one short Hemingway-esque sentence and then one 500-word Faulknerian sentence. And, you know, eventually through that long, horrible process, I began to come to something like a voice of my own. But somebody said to me just the other day, Howard, I'm just an aspiring writer, but, and I said, well, excuse me just a minute, but before you ask your question, I'm just an aspiring writer too. Every time I go to my desk, I'm an aspiring writer all over again, because often what the techniques and the approach that worked for the most recent book don't work for the one in progress, and you have to learn how to do it again all over again. Yeah, yes, sir.
All right, how about dialogue? Did you spend a lot of time listening to the patrons of the non-country? I mean, you nailed it
Thank you.
so well. I mean, you really
Yeah,
did.
I've spent a shameful amount of time listening to old-time storytellers when any other person would be working for a living. I was up at the post office listening to the old timers. Thank you, Phyllis, for teaching for 40 years. What a nice audience you've been. I'd be glad to sign some books. Thank you very much.